Reb Shlomo Aaron Kazanovsky came running into 770 the morning of Chov Dalet Tevis Tov Shin Yud Aleph, which is 15 days to be exact, before the Rebbe officially assumed the position of Rebbe on Yud Shvat in that year, 1951. He came into 770 and found the Rebbe, who at that time was still hesitating to take the position, and he approached the Rebbe with some exciting news. He had a dream, and he wanted to share his dream with the Rebbe. In his dream, he describes the Friedrich Rebbe's Farbrengen Tisch, Farbrengen room, which was actually his dining room upstairs. And all the Chassidim were sitting around, and naturally the previous Rebbe is sitting at the head of the table, and his two son-in-laws are sitting in their respective places. The Rashag, the older son-in-law, sat to the previous Rebbe's right. The Rebbe, who was called then the Ramash, sat to the Friedrich Rebbe's left, and all the Chassidim are around. And Rebbe Kazanovsky, of course, is experiencing this in a dream. And the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, turns to him in his dream and asks him why everybody is so sad. So Rabbi Kazanovsky tells the previous Rebbe, they're sad because you left us, you abandoned us. So the Friedrich Rebbe says, but I left you my son-in-law, the Rebbe. And Rabbi Kazanovsky responds with, but he continues to say that he is not the Rebbe, you continue to be the Rebbe, and for Hasidim this is quite difficult to swallow. So in the dream, Rabbi Kazanovsky witnesses the previous Rebbe turn to our Rebbe and say to him, Ma titzak Eloi, daber el bnei Yisrael v'yisau. And he translated in Yiddish, Farvos schreist du wegen his kashus zu mir, zog chsidus zu Yidden, wollen sie ein Kegen geben Mashiach. Which means, he says to the Rebbe, why do you insist on referring back to me as though I am the Rebbe? Speak Chassidus to the Chassidim and you'll lead them towards Mashiach. So Rebbe Kazanovsky comes into 770 very excited, and he says to the Rebbe, you see Rebbe, here's another case in point, another illustration of the fact that it's quite clear that you're supposed to be Rebbe. So I suspect that the Rebbe probably asked Rabbi Kazanovsky to repeat the dream a second time, although I wasn't there. And when he finished, the Rebbe said, I didn't have that dream. So it can't be a true dream. Had it been a true dream, we both would have had the dream. It must be that you were thinking about it by day, so you dreamt it at night. The Rebbe has a journal where he records his interactions, his discussions with his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. The very first entry into that journal is quite compelling, it's quite telling. The previous Rebbe calls the Rebbe into his room. The date happens to be Hey Tevis, Tafresh Peites. And he says to the Rebbe, to his son-in-law, I have regards from your brother Label, who was still living in Russia at the time. So the Rebbe says, did you get a letter from him? Did you get a phone call from him? What kind of correspondence? He says, no, we were together in a dream. And he proceeds to tell the Rebbe that night he had a dream and he saw his father, and he described how his father looked, and that he was wearing a shtreimel, a fur hat, which the previous Rebbe had put on for the first time when the Rebbe became a Rebbe, which his father acknowledged. And in the background there were some people. And the Rebbe Rashab turns to see who the people are, and he asks, who's that? And this was the Rebbe's brother Label, and then he says, I know who you are. So the Friedrich Rebbe tells the Rebbe, I have regards from your brother Label from a dream, and he tells him a part of the Chassidus which the Rebbe Rashab told him in that dream, and he adds, the rest of it you'll ask your brother. As though the Friedrich Rebbe took it for granted that if he and Label were in a dream together, Label had the same dream and would have the same recollections and would be in a position to fill the Rebbe in on the missing details and the missing pieces of the puzzle. What does Judaism say about dreams? True, false, good, bad, useful, useless? It seems, at least to my understanding, that there are useful dreams and there are empty dreams. There are meaningless dreams and meaningful dreams. Sometimes dreams mean nothing at all. As the Zohar describes it, which is quoted in Tanya chapter 29, when a person goes to sleep, their consciousness is compromised, which means their deliberateness and control over self is at rest. So their imagination runs amok, and the forces of heaven mock a person. They riddle the person with all kinds of thoughts and ideas, and the person has no capacity to steer towards them or away from them or to utilize them. The person is a prisoner. But on occasion, dreams are incredibly meaningful. In fact, Rambam writes that one of the basic mediums for prophecy is a dream. Prophecies either happen in dream or in visions. As we have, in fact, in our Parsha, Yosef HaTzadik has dreams, and of course later in the Parsha, the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOifim have dreams, and those dreams are very, very far from nothing. They're incredibly meaningful and real dreams. The Rambam discusses a concept called Koyach HaMedameh, which means a human being's power of imagination. Rambam holds that a person has a number of different souls: an intellectual soul, an emotional soul, a soul of life, which is the basis for metabolism, and a human being also has a soul of the imagination. And the Rambam considers the soul of the imagination superior even to the soul of the human heart, of emotions, based on the belief that the imagination of a person is a space, I'll put it to you in psychological terms first, which allows for incredible creativity. Rambam says that that space of imagination and creativity is the framework where prophecy can happen if a person is in the right level, frame of mind, and spiritual space, so to speak. So dreams, which have everything to do with dimyan, with imagination, because what happens in a dream is that you don't have original visions in dreams. You can't see something in a dream which you have no knowledge of from before. Dreams are simply the distortion, the overlap, the entanglement of different realities to create artificial ones, like the classic images of the head of an animal, the body of a person, and vice versa. We know what a person is, we know what an animal is. The dream creates the artificial configurations, unities, specific visuals. And yes, frequently dreams are meaningless, but on occasion dreams have incredible significance, incredible depth, because through this distortion of reality in the world of the imaginary, all kinds of incredibly useful aspects can emerge. The Maamar we're going to learn is going to explore the upside of dreams. In other words, the upside of the imaginary and the distorted and the disfigured and the entangled, how it serves a very, very positive purpose. And if you will, if I may say it in other words, we're going to be exploring dreams with the pretext, with the presumption that a dream is a distortion of reality. It's not unreal. In other words, it's not based on no reality. It isn't real either. It's a disfiguring of reality. Whatever reality is messed up in a dream. Messed up because it's changed, messed up because it's confused, messed up because it's the overlap of different realities superimposed upon one another to create the emergence of an imaginary world which is simply unreal. And we're going to explore what could possibly be the upside of dreaming. And without wasting any time, let's get to the Maamar proper. So if you are so inclined, we're beginning line 1 in the beginning of the Maamar. This is a Maamar, of course, of Parshas Vayeishev, which is the Parsha of this week, that begins with dreams and ends with dreams. It begins with Yosef HaTzadik's dreams, and it ends with the dreams of the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOifim. And just for the record, next week, Parshas Miketz, again begins with dreams. You're dealing with the dreams of the Pari, of the Pharaoh in Egypt. And the Pasuk says, Shir Hamaaloss, this is a song of ascent, B'shuv v'goymer, which is a reference to the song that the Jewish nation will sing when the Jewish people are brought back from Shivat Zion, when they're brought back to the Holy Land after having been exiled. And the Pasuk finishes with the words, Hayinu kecholm, we were as a dream. Which means basically that the Jewish nation have gone off into exile. They're being brought back into the Holy Land. And the David HaMelech indicates that the return from the exile to the Holy Land is like waking up. It's coming out of having been in a distorted, dreamlike realm, in a distorted, dreamlike condition, and being brought back to awareness, brought back to consciousness, brought back to reality. And I'm sure you know the Mishnah and the Gemara, Masechta Tainis, which is quite famous, that Choni HaMagal, the great Tana, Choni HaMagal, wondered how can you compare 70 years of suffering to a dream, and the Talmud tells us the elaborate, the lengthy story of how he, in fact, ended up sleeping for 70 years. And when he wakes up from his dream, he sees a person who was the great-grandson of the person he'd met prior to his slumber, and there's a quite interesting unfolding of events that follow. Unfortunately, Choni HaMagal could find no friends, he could find no peace, and he didn't live much longer after, but God literally demonstrated for him this phenomena that 70 years could be as a dream. But that's a very technical, a very literal, a very actual interpretation. Our Maamar analyzes the relationship between Golus and dreams in a more spiritual or even a psychological way. So the Maamar begins, Hine, the definition of a dream is mechaber shnei hofchim. It binds two opposites. Benoisi echad into one scheme, into one framework, into one stage. Umarkiv, and it grafts, it overlaps. Shnei inyanim hofchim, two opposite, diametrically opposed phenomena or perceptions, ki'ilu hayol achadim, as though they were one. That's what happens in a dream. Every aspect of the dream is real. The context, the relationship between the aspects, is where the distortion lies. Vahainu, and the Alter Rebbe interprets, mipnei, the idea behind this is simple. Ki b'shina, what happens when we sleep? Nistalek moyach haseichel hamavchen. The intellectual power of discernment, of separation, is compromised, departs. When we're awake, we have brain power, we have intelligence that empowers us to separate fancy from fact, exaggeration from reality, and the imaginary from the real. And your brain says, this is foolish, this is ridiculous, this never happened, this couldn't possibly happen, and so forth. And so long as we're awake, we use our deliberate mind to assess, to judge the various thoughts that come from our subconscious into our consciousness, or that we perhaps have incorporated into our awareness from outside of ourselves, and we sift them through. What's true, we incorporate into our body of knowledge, and what's obviously a distortion, we dispose of. But when a person goes to sleep, that power, that critical thinking, that power of discernment is compromised. V'loi nishar, and what remains is rakeh hamadame, the imaginary power. In other words, when a person sleeps, the brain is not shut down. What's shut down is the power of the brain, the control over the mind. So the mind continues to race, but it goes wherever it will. Who determines where the mind will go while we're asleep? So there's a mystical explanation that has to do with what's happening in metaphysical realms. And of course, there's very practical explanations. And the practical explanations are that while we dream, our subconscious has free reign. In other words, what we really are, that when we're awake, we deliberately control and don't allow to emerge, has opportunity to manifest and to express itself, because we don't have the control, the power to steer ourselves either away from a particular thought or the direction of a particular thought, and so forth. Says the Rebbe, v'koyach hamadabe, one's imagination, yachal harkiv, can graft, can overlap, beis in yonim hafchim, even two conflicted, even two opposite things. K'moi, for example, sfina rotza ba'avir v'chulu, a flying boat, as Rambam writes in his introduction to the Pirkei Avos. Now, at the time of the Rambam, a flying boat was a totally ridiculous postulation. In the modern world, a flying boat is not only not a ridiculous postulation, it's a fait accompli, it's a fact. Ships fly, and considerably large boats and airplanes can fly. I suppose the Rambam was discussing the world as he knew it, and in his world, for a person to visualize a flying boat and perceive it as being real is completely ridiculous and imaginary. I suppose there's probably ideas that today would be as ridiculous for us as that was for the Rambam. Like, for example, the capacity to travel through time, using a machine to travel through time. You know, in your imagination, in fantasy, you can think of whatever you wish. It's simply not real to fact. So when you're asleep, there is this distortion, and the distortion is, in essence, an overlapping and entangling and confusing of various different realities. When a person is awake, the power of one's mind and creativity and direction is renewed, and as a result, he dominates the imagination. In other words, when we're awake, our imagination also runs amok, and it's running all over the place. And imagination is a great gift, because imagination is a tool which allows the mind to experience things in a very, very real way. So it helps the mind, the intellect, process. But the imagination needs to be controlled, or it'll just go wherever, so to speak, its heart desires. That's what happens when we sleep. But when we're awake, we control our imagination, and we don't allow our imagination, laharkiv, to distort and to entangle reality, because the human mind obviously identifies that the two ideas that the imagination in the dream-like state wish to entangle and confuse are separate. And there's no unity, there's no relationship, there's no connectedness between them. So the first 5 lines of this Maamar gave us an analysis of dreams. What is a dream? Why, when we're awake, don't we dream? I mean, there are people who, hate to fall asleep because their daydreams are so wonderful, but for most people, most of the time, it's a good idea to steer your mind in useful and constructive directions. When we sleep, we forfeit that deliberateness, that mastery over self, and the mind wanders wherever it will. Now, a couple of thoughts. The first is a comment the previous Rebbe made about American Jews. The previous Rebbe visited America in 1929 and 1930. And of course, he returned in March 1941 to live here permanently. During his initial visit, he traveled extensively and met many, many American Jews, and to be sure, he was quite impressed by them. The previous Rebbe felt that they have an incredible future as Jews, as the continuers of the torch of Jewishness and Yiddishkeit and so forth. But he made a comment which is, whether we like it or not, quite true to life. And that is, in Yiddish he said, Amerikaner heizen sich schnell an und killen sich so schnell ab. Americans are very easily inspired, but they just as quickly lose interest. Some would argue that the two are interconnected. If it's easier to move somebody, you're not moving very much. And we're not moving very much, it doesn't take very much to move them in a totally different direction. If you will, to say this in other words, there is a phenomenon called intelligence. Some people are more intelligent, other people are less intelligent. Intelligence is understood to mean the capacity for one to reason, to assess, to analyze reality, matter, facts, and to incorporate them, to internalize them, and to integrate them, and so forth. There's another phenomenon called depth and integrity, which in Hebrew, in Lashon Hasidus, is das. Integrity, depth, das, is not necessarily linked to intelligence. A person could be a genius, can be brilliant, and be a baby, a child. A person could be intellectually quite ordinary and have incredible depth and integrity. This is why Chassidus says a child of 12 who's as bright as Einstein is pater from mitzvahs, while an adult who's 15 who has half the IQ of Einstein has full obligation to do mitzvahs, because our capacity to remain loyal to God is not based on our capacity to understand. It's our capacity to personalize, to care. And that's not a matter of intelligence, that's a matter of depth. And it's an undeniable fact that frequently, or sometimes, people with great intelligence are babies, they're immature. Why these things exist is a discussion for another time, but there's a considerable amount of truth to that. Because intelligence means your ability to process and integrate knowledge. Depth means the capacity to live by that knowledge. And they're very different. Our Maamar will proceed to describe the equivalent of a dream in human experience and connect it to Golus. Jews in Gullus aren't necessarily suffering. Certainly not Jews in the United States of America. But we're in Gullus nevertheless. We're exiled nevertheless. In what way can you define our Gullus? And the answer is our distractedness. The capacity for us to lose interest from one thing to another, which is a symptom not of a lack of intelligence, a symptom of a lack of depth. We're all Jews, we all study Judaism, but how deeply does Judaism grab us? That has to do, or is reflected by, how deeply we are committed to Judaism. And it can be said that frequently simple people have an incredible adikut, devoutness, commitment to Yiddishkeit, while people of far greater intelligence have a very cavalier attitude about it. It's not always the case, naturally. But it's also not always the case that one's religiosity is a reflection of one's intelligence. One's religiosity is a reflection of one's depth and conviction. And that's what the Maamar now proceeds to describe. Line 6, please. This entire illustration of the dreamlike state is analogous to what happens during the exile. Exile doesn't necessarily mean suffrage. It simply means to be a little bit less in tune with ourselves as real, and therefore with our God as real, and with our Torah and our mitzvahs and our world as real. So we flip-flop. We move from reality to reality with very little frustration, with very, very little reconsideration, and with very, very little sense of conscience. He says, Nitzitz halakus b'nefesh ha'adam, the divine spark in the Jewish soul, shu b'bchinas shina v'histalkus hamoichin, finds itself in a sleep-like state with a lack of moichin. Moichin literally means intelligence, but in context, moichin means depth, a sense of connection. And he explains. This explains why it's conceivable for a person alive during the times of the exile laharkiv beis dvarim hafchiyim, to distort, to entangle two opposites in the following way. Lehiyais kol hayoyim, to spend all of his day torot, preoccupied, obsessed, overwhelmed, b'masu matan, with one's commerce, business affairs. Ish levitze miktehu, each one is attempting to pursue his craft to earn his keep. Zeh one is preoccupied in earning money through an olive orchard, v'chulu, and so forth. In other words, each one has their own means of livelihood. And in the words of the Alter Rebbe, we're taking it far too seriously. We're taking it far too seriously because we're forgetting the context. And the context is that we're in God's world. He says, Hagam b'shebet tefillah, line 8. Though when we davened, we all arouse love for God. One wishes, one is motivated to strip himself away from his garments, in other words, from the reality which is his or hers in terms of the material world. To make their endeavor, to make what's important to them, attachedness to God, as a consequence of thinking about God. A higher kind of unity, which means there's nothing other than God. And a lower kind of unity, which means I exist, but my purpose is to serve my Maker. And when we daven, when we pray, we're inspired by those thoughts and those feelings. And God becomes incredibly meaningful and real to us. Afal became still, as soon as we finish praying. The love departs and passes. And one does not even notice and be aware of the fact that he has just abandoned and gone away from everything he invested in when he prayed. He talked about God, and God was so real. Now he talks about money and the world and commerce, and God is not a part of it at all. You know, the Alter Rebbe, and he gets the Chassidishe Simon Test, describes it based on a pasuk. He says a person closes his eyes and says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which means there's nothing but God. Then you reopen your eyes, God vanishes, and the world reappears. This is a phenomenon which is more real to life than we'd like to admit. We daven, we focus on God, and God is incredibly real. The challenge of a person is not to be split, to have unity between our material lives and our spiritual lives. And the Alter Rebbe is arguing that our capacity to have this contradiction is because we're asleep. We're awake, we're going through the motions, but there's something fundamental, something very deep, lacking in our sense of perception, because Golus, in a way, numbs us. It doesn't make us less intelligent. It takes away some of our depth and our integrity. Umedama belev, line 10, please. One imagines. Laharkiv ulachaber shnei inyanim hafkim yachad. To graft and to fuse two opposites. In other words, there's no conflict between totally engrossed in materialism just for materialism's sake and being a pious and religious person. Ki'ilu hayal achadim, as though they're joined and one. Ube'emes, when in fact heim nifradim or rechoikim zemizeh, they're separated and completely removed from one another. So the Alter Rebbe says our capacity to flip-flop from being very spiritual beings to be very, not just worldly, but materialistic beings is a conflict, it's a contradiction. We live that contradiction in part because nothing we experience is being experienced fully. There's a numbness about our person, which is a symptom of galus. But then the Alter Rebbe asks a question. Doesn't it say that life is about work? Aren't we here in this life not just to study and to pray, but actually to make a living, to harvest our fields? The Shema also recites, you serve God with all of your heart, which means you give your spiritual self to God, and God reciprocates. And He will bless us with rain, and with the reward of rain, which is of course grain, and so forth. So is it not true that the Torah also argues for a need to a person to blend, to fuse involvement in material things in the material world and a spiritual relationship? The answer is of course, but the blend has to be right. Hine, hakel hu al derech avoda. It all must be a part of service to God. Ki yadu, as it is known, shebechol inyonei olam hazeh, every aspect of the material world, any aspect of our materialism, yesh bohem inyan avodas Hashem, has within it a level, a form, a type of practice which makes it serving God. So it's not involvement in materialism per se. That's the issue. It's the complete obsession. An obsession in such a way where there's no room for God in our material lives. There's a famous quote from a 19th century anatomist, I believe, who dissected the body, if I'm not mistaken, and he presented at a conference of some sort his model of anatomy, and when asked, where is God, he responded by saying, there's no need for God in my model. In other words, maybe God exists, but outside. In the life of a Jew, there's no two models. There's no our material selves and our God self. They need to be fused. And our capacity to convince ourselves that we fuse the two when in fact we're living a contradiction is based on a numbness, on a lack of sensitivity. And he continues and he says, Sheishonim tizra v'goyim, 6 years we seed, uvashana shvius, in the 7th year the world rests. Translates the Maamar at the end of line 14, v'hu inyan habirurim shebebchinas sheishonim. This is the notion of bringing clarity into God's world over the course of the 6 years when we work, and v'ha'Allah, raising up this that we brought clarity to, shebebchinas hashanah shvius, during our 7th year, as Chassidus explains it and discusses it. So, says the Alter Rebbe, beginning on line 16, what separates healthy investment in the material world and compromised investment in the material world? And the answer is very plain. Va'achar kavanas halev hein hadvorim. It's about attitude. It's about intent. It's about focus. What are we thinking about? What's our priority? If our priority is that this is in the service of God, it's healthy. If a priority this is in the pursuit of self and materialism, it's a contradiction. The famous story, you've heard it before, about this Jew who belonged to a Chassidic movement. But because of business, he used to travel frequently to the West, to Germany, to France. And it's very uncomfortable dressing like a Chassid in the 19th century Western Europe. So he would change clothes. Whenever he traveled west, he would put on modern clothing. And he was always careful that he should never be caught by his Hasidic friends and by his Hasidic master. And when he returned to the state where his Chassidus was, where his home was, he would put on the traditional clothing. And he once decided that he doesn't want to be a hypocrite anymore. And he came to his Rebbe dressed modern. In other words, I'm going to show the Rebbe what I really am, and I'm not going to hide. And his Rebbe looks at him and says to him, Ich hab gemeint, als die ganze Zeit hast du genarrt der Welt. Ist es echt, als die ganze Zeit hast du uns genarrt. I thought you were trying to fool the West, that you're one of them when you're actually one of us. Turns out you were fooling us. That's the question. The balance between the God in our lives, the spirituality in our lives, and our involvement in the material world is where our heart is, for real. In other words, is our materialism part of the divine service, or is the divine service the hechsher, the stamp of approval? I can be involved in Gashmias, look, I'm religious. That kind of conflict is inconsistent. It's hypocritical, and it's a symptom of Golus. Most people, who are pursuant of wealth, that their entire preoccupation is to acquire what they need for material sustenance. That's not what their heart envisages. Their heart is not fixed, is not centered to the ideal purpose. Their entire wish and their entire desire is to satisfy their material needs, in their bodily desires. They make their involvement in materialism a priority, and of course, they make from their materialism a priority that's totally separate from their religious self. Says the Rebbe, line 18, it's the diametrical opposite of a Chassidishe Parsha, what the entire purpose that we're trying to achieve when we pray. Because when we daven, we're not just trying to be close to God. We're trying to be close to God in this world. And that's distorted, that's compromised. That should be planted in one's heart, a love for God alone, without any entanglement of something alien. So, the point is, the argument is, that when a person davens, there's a certain type of distortion which says, in effect, that there is an inconsistency in their life. So it sounds like the constant, or the similarity between Golus and sleep is, when a person sleeps, there's a confusion of realities, and in Golus, we somehow manage to confuse realities. And the question becomes, two questions. Why do people dream? Why are people in Golus? If dreaming is a distortion and unreal, and Golus is a distortion and unreal, how is it useful? And certainly, Hashem doesn't put us into Golus just because He likes to watch us be confused. So the Alter Rebbe now, on line 20, begins his proposal. V'hine. The proposal I just put forth could lead a person to say, I'm stuck in Golus. How do we say it honestly? I am a hypocrite and I can't do anything about it. Says the Rebbe, don't despair. Loimar, to conclude, every effort I make to be passionate when I pray. And the intellectual investment I make in desiring to come close to God. Are fantasies of futility. Because clearly, evidently, in my practical life, I'm living in a dream-like, conflicted state. In other words, it's entirely the human imagination, which is joining two opposites. Says Alter Rebbe, don't get so upset. There's in fact incredible merit. In other words, God puts us into Golus, there's a point. When one sees after he davens, his love for God passes. And his obsession is only with his material self. How they move on. The argument is that this indicates that even while he davened, his love for self never departed. In other words, when he was in fact davening and being aroused to be completely focused on loving God, it wasn't true. and instead the person deduces and concludes like a fantasy, of a dream, which joins two opposites. And the person therefore decides that during the davening he thinks he loves God, when in truth, even while he's saying I love God, he loves himself. So all of this is very depressing. If the best we could do is be excited about God, and then because afterwards we get busy with other things, it proves in retrospect that our excitement about God was illegitimate, that leaves us as spiritual beings in a deep sleep, in a not good space. Argues the Alter Rebbe as follows. Though they shouldn't be together, because it's based on one's imagination, that we can imagine fantasies of futility, so the person feels like a hypocrite, like unwhole, nowhere, if you will. So Alter Rebbe is now going to say something incredibly positive. Before we move on, I'm holding line 27. Let me share with you an idea. There's a Maamar from the Rebbe Rashab from Tov Reish Ayin Ches. That would be 1918 or 17. Of Vayechi Maamar, Oisila Geffen Irai Lasereka B'ni Asayin. It's based on Cholim, one of the vowels of the Hebrew alphabet. And in that Maamar, the Rebbe Rashab talks about dreams. It says something quite interesting and perhaps a little bit off the beaten path. What he says is that dreams are incredibly therapeutic. Why? He says people frequently have experiences that are very painful. And when you have experiences that are painful, one of the classic psychological techniques of the subconscious is to suppress, shut it out. And of course, one of the things that psychoanalysis is so busy with is finding those locked up spaces and trying to release them. So the Rebbe Rashab says, in effect, that when a person sleeps, their senses are dulled. In other words, none of the senses are that acute. The consequence of that dullness, of that lack of acuity, is that we can afford to explore parts of ourselves that we would otherwise suppress. So when you dream, because you don't feel, you can explore painful things, difficult things, confusing things, and resolve them in a dreamlike state so that it's not that painful, and yet it gets worked through. This is a very, very positive, very enlightened Chassidic interpretation of dreams, that it allows us to find areas of ourselves that we could only deal with in our numbed state. The Maamar we're reading here is going to say something similar, not identical, but similar, that there's a reason for Gullus, there's a reason for dream, there's an upside to it. And the upside will be that because dreams are entangled and confused, because Gullus is entangled and confused, there's a possibility to find infinity. In a world of perfect order, everything is limited, everything is contained. And if each aspect is limited and contained, the whole picture is contained. But because dreams and Gullus are entangled and confused, woven into that fabric, woven into that entanglement is a phenomena of entanglement itself. In other words, possibilities that when fully explored can amount to something much, much greater and much, much more. And they only become accessible because of this distortion and this confusion. So let's read on. Line 27. Ach be'emes, the truth needs to be said, Hine bechinas chaloim zeh, this phenomena of dream, shar shoy l'mayla, has a very high source on high. V'yesei b'haradei kedesh elyon, its foundation is in the holy mountains on high. And the Alter Rebbe, proceeds to bring forward the positive side of the entanglement of dreams and correspondingly of the Gullus. Says the Rebbe V'Yuvan, line 28, this can be explained. Beheg the Mashakosov, based on the fact that we read in the Tanakh. And of course this is qualified by the Gemara, that when Mashiach comes, B'Yomahu, on that day, Yihi Hashem Echad U'Shmei Echad, Mashiach comes, God will be one, and His name will be one. So the Gemara asks the obvious question, Atu, is it not true, Ha'idna, at the moment, that Lav Shmei Echadu, is God's name not one now? And of course the Gemara says, we do not pronounce God's name as it's written. We write it Yud Kei Vav Kei, and we pronounce it Aleph Daled Nun Yud, and when Mashiach comes, we're going to say it the way it's written. And the Rebbe is going to explain the significance of this lack of clarity. The idea that God's name is written one way and is pronounced a different way, and when Mashiach comes, that will be reversed. The idea is as follows. The name of God is representative of exile. Exile means a confusion, a darkness. The name of God, if you will, makes it difficult for us to relate to God directly. We're relating to Him only through a name or through a function, and so forth. We can't afford to pronounce it as it's written. We pronounce it differently because what we are saying is a compromised version of what God's name really is. In other words, in mystical terms, the name of God represents godliness, Ein Sof. The name of God we employ, Adnai, connotes the concealment of the Ein Sof and simply the fact that God is the master of the world. This is reality as you and I live it. None of us are sensitive, or most of us are not sensitive to the Ein Sof. At best, we see God as a master, Adnai. And the fact that we call Him Adnai distances us from the greater truth that there is a unity between God and the world, which is complete. It says the Rebbe V'hinei, Begolus hu b'bchinas shina v'histalkus hamoichin. Golus is a time of sleep and a departure of the deeper dimensions which provide clarity. And instead you have tlas klilan v'chulu. Tlas klilan v'chulu is a Zoharic expression, which means literally three are curled up within three, which are curled up within three. In practical terms, tlas klilan means a fetal state. An unborn baby is curled up. All that functions is the lower third of the person, the metabolic function. The heart doesn't function, the mind doesn't function. All that's function is the intestines and so forth. Golus is a similar state. The more sophisticated aspects of the creation and of people is curled up in more basic aspects of the reality. Va'az, and then, nishmasai meshachas lechayim milmayla v'chuli. The soul still endeavors to access godliness from on high, but the neshama is not able to translate it. Since the neshama is in a fetal position, the soul is not able to fully manifest what it is, which spiritually means its mind, its heart, and its senses. What the soul accesses instead is, in effect, godliness, which is in a fetal state, curled up. Godliness in a fetal, curled up state, is that good or bad? Now, on the surface, it's obviously not good because it's not developed, it's not opened up. A person is born, they're supposed to stretch out. But mystically, that circle, that lack of openness, that lack of development represents a closed possibility, a closed potential, which has in theory within it Ein Sof, infinity, that's curled up in the lack of openness and development and so forth. Says the Rebbe, there's no distinctive aspects. There's a simple unity. And it affects an integration and a unity of kol ha'inyanim, of all aspects, b'lishum pirud v'hischalkus, without any divisions and detail. There's a level where all versions of Torah are correct, and it's only in a very specific level of Torah where you can discern and say, this is right and this is wrong. When it comes down through specific channels or pathways, there becomes a division of kav yamin chesed, the right side being kind, and so forth. In other words, where are there divisions? Where are there details? Where there is order. Divisions and details exist only where there is order. Order means limitation. Chaos, the eagle model, the circular model, and disorder is obviously not good. But hidden within that can be, and there is, infinite possibility. Mashenkin bebchinas igulim, in the chaotic realm, in the circular realm, in the spherical realm, ein sham eschalkus klal, there is no divisions. V'sham kol ha'dvarim hamispardim lamata, all things that may perhaps later become subdivided and departmentalized, mechubarim uklulim yachad, are fused and integrated together. There's no disparateness, v'hischalkus, and subdivisions between them. So the argument is, in a Golos-like state, we also reach for godliness. But the godliness we access, we ourselves cannot process. We can't discern within it, we can't departmentalize it because we're not that sophisticated. On the other hand, because we're not in a position to develop it and open it up, we're accessing raw godliness. And the argument of the Maamar is, at the time of Golos, that raw godliness is an entanglement and a confusion. At the end of the Golos, that raw godliness will show itself to have much more potential than it would have had we lived controlled and orderly lives in Golos, where what we would be accessing would be finite alone. A great little anecdote, I think this will help a bit, enlighten this. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, was a very famous Rebbe, with thousands of Chassidim. With a great Gaon, and a great Tzaddik, and an incredible Asken Tziburi. There's much to say about the Tzemach Tzedek. But there was one very strange feature about how he would meet people in Yechidus. And that was that there was no line. People wanted audiences with the Rebbe. They would just wait in the hall and push their way into the Rebbe's room. And Kol Da'al Gvar. If you were bigger and stronger, you got in first. It didn't matter if you were wiser or deeper or older or more respected. It was pandemonium. And somebody once said to the Tzemach Tzedek, why don't you organize this? What's the purpose of having a bunch of people milling around in a hallway, and the people who actually get to see you because of random or because of power? So the Tzemach Tzedek said in Yiddish, Da kommt einer, was ich darf haben mehr, wie mir. Und kommt daher und stupt sich, bis kommt zum Tier, und mir stupt ab bis in Wand. Und stupt sich, bis kommt zum Tier, und mir stupt ab bis in Wand. Und stupt sich, bis geht zu mir rein. Der Fahr darf ich haben, aber soll sich stuppen. Which means, the Tzemach Tzedek says, there's a person who comes here, obviously a hidden tzaddik. I need him more than he needs me. So he comes and he pushes his way to the door. Pushes, and he's right by the door and someone throws him across the room. So he pushes, and he's thrown back. In the end, he enters into my room. This person would never make an appointment. He would never come into the Tzemach Tzedek if there was order. Why? Because he's hidden. The chaos, the disorder, the pandemonium allows for this kind of a soul to make its way to the Tzemach Tzedek. So the Tzemach Tzedek, I need this disorder to meet this person. Now, I'm not trying to discourage chaos and disorder. We have a sufficient measure of that without this Maimar's encouragement. But what the Maamar is really saying is that there is an upside to the confusion. There's the upside to the inconsistency. And that is that frequently in our inconsistency, frequently there are energies, lights, pearls that we access that are incredibly potent, that really we don't deserve. And if our lives were perfectly orderly, we would not get. And we get them in the confusion. And of course the point is that when Mashiach comes, all of these potentia are opened up and materialized, and they justify the dream-like existence of Golos. In other words, the downside of Golos, that it is an entangled and confused state where when we think about God, we're so religious, and we think about other things, God essentially doesn't exist, which is a compromised condition of existence. It allows for certain possibilities, nuggets of godliness to sink into our world that don't belong there based on our level. And when Mashiach comes, they emerge, and they reward, they justify this confusion. Continues the Rebbe, I'm reading now line 37. To access these infinite potentia that appear to us in this curled up, underdeveloped state. Eina, cannot be. Only when one is semi-numb, so to speak, in a dreamlike state, and a state where their consciousness and their focus and their control over self is a bit deficient. Because when we're very focused, we're in control. And we're very controlled, we dispose of things we can't interpret. We dispose of things that are not consistent with our measure of order at this moment. And we forfeit those incredible possibilities. As the Pasuk describes it, Albish Shamayim Kadrus. God Almighty says, I will fill the heavens with blackness. And he interprets. Shamayim, the heavens, they represent the realm of the sphere. In other words, where godliness is curled up in an underdeveloped state, where its aspects are non-distinctive. Make themselves available to us through darkness. In other words, hiddenness and concealment. That then and only then, it shines and it twinkles or it gleams from above, from some higher world, which is in fact an infinite world, in a dreamlike state, which is the power of the imagination or dreams, to join two opposites, mamish, as they were one and the same. You know, the Chazal tell us that during Golus, prophecy was given to children and to fools. Explain it how you will. But one way of explaining that statement is that when a person is foolish or a person is not that sophisticated, there's room in their consciousness for God to pass messages through them. When you're sophisticated and focused and in control, if something doesn't seem consistent with your reason, you dispose of it. So the Rebbe argues this dreamlike state allows for us to sometimes access incredibly powerful energies and lights that if we were totally focused and completely engaged consciously, we would simply throw them away. Because the truth is, in their source, in the highest realms, in the realm of the infinite, all detail is unified. In godliness, there's no division, there's no departmentalization. Everything is fused, everything is one. In our reality, there's a need for things to be departmentalized and separated into different pathways. Based on reason, based on discernment, based on judgment. This pathway should have this tendency. And an alternative path should have a different tendency. The contradiction is exposed. This is the opposite of this. And then they become separated, distanced from one another. So, if in the infinite realm there's unity, and in the finite but orderly realm there has to be divisions. The consequence of this is, it is impossible to bring forward potentia, godly energies that incorporate contradictions because of their infinity, into a revealed state in the world of Chokhmah. Why? Because Chokhmah sheireshis his chalkos akaven, the beginning of departmentalization, the beginning of order is Chokhmah. Chokhmah means order, Chokhmah means control, and Chokhmah means departmentalizing, which is all good. But there's no junkyard. There's no space for entanglement in a perfect system. What the Alter Rebbe is arguing is that frequently in what is entangled there is more possibility than can be tolerated by the order. So the order would dispose of it. So God's solution to this problem is exile. A deficiency of order, a lack of full control allows incredibly powerful possibilities of infinite energies, of, as he calls it here, unified energies, to come into our world, only to be resolved and discerned, separated, organized, when the world is capable of receiving it. Ella, line 45, when the world is in a exiled state, which is the equivalent to sleep and the departure of one's clarity. Azai, under those conditions, mitznoi, there is a glistening, a gleaming, a sparkling. Umeir ha'oir ha'elyon, this supernal light finds an opportunity to emerge in our world because v'hu mistater u'misalim b'bchinas kadas v'choshech. It can afford to enter into our world because there's sufficient darkness to allow them to find space for themselves. They take on the form of concealment, and not a state of revelation. Because when things are revealed, they need to be organized and they need to be departmentalized. And if there would be something here that wouldn't fit into the model of a finite system, even though its possibility is in fact incredible, it would be disposed of. What is revealed has to conform to reason and order, which is based on the individual tendencies and channels and so forth. So the Rebbe is saying there's a very big upside to Golus, namely that the confusion of Golus allows godliness that doesn't fit into the finite order of limited people to have space. But the confusion and the entanglement gives us opportunity to permit such energies to enter into our world, to enter into our person. And when Mashiach comes, we can hybrid, we can integrate those infinite possibilities into our orderly selves, because we're going to be living in a better world. Rabbi Weinberg tells a story. Rabbi Weinberg, of course, was for many years a fundraiser for the yeshiva, for Temchet Mimim. And he dreamt that he sees the Friedrich Rebbe, the previous Rebbe. And the previous Rebbe says to him that I'd like for you to ton a bissel in Maimed, which means to say, do a little bit to support the causes of the Rebbe directly, that are called in the Chabad culture Maimed. So when he woke up from his dream, he had a yechidus with the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe about this dream and asked the Rebbe what to make of it. So the Rebbe told him it's a good dream, and he thinks he should fulfill it. In other words, he should get involved in Maimed. But the Rebbe added, Ein chaloim b'li devarim b'teilem. There's no dream without an aspect that's imprecise. In other words, dreams, even if they're true dreams and are useful dreams, there are aspects that need to be perfected. And the Rebbe said, what I think you should perfect is, anstatt ton a bissel in Maimed, sollst du ton a sach in Maimed. Instead of raising a little bit of money for the Rebbe's causes directly, raise a lot of money for the Rebbe's causes directly. So, if we understand this story, Rabbi Weinberg, so to speak, gets a mission in a dream, which means there's credibility to it, but there's a bit of confusion to it, and the Rebbe organizes for it by saying to him, do much. And perhaps, if that message had been given to him while he was awake, it would have been too difficult a message. But the fact that it came through a dream and then was later interpreted, if you will, when he was redeemed from that dreamlike state, it put him in a position to carry out not only what he was told, but what was intended. I want to tell you one more story before I conclude. It's a very powerful story with the Rebbe Rashab, with the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. He repeated it to the previous Rebbe, and the story is printed in the Siches, and it's also in the Sefer HaToldos, that he wanted to go into his father to Yechidus. It's a story with a lot of details. The end of the story was his father told him to come, I think he said Fartog, early or at night, which meant sometime between 12 and 2 in the morning. And he describes how he had fallen into a deep sleep, and he woke up and he washed himself and he readied himself and he went into his father, and his father engaged him in conversation. And they talked about whatever for a period of time. Suddenly his father asks him, tell me what you dreamt. Tell me the dream you just had. So the Rebbe Rashab was gripped by fear. He was completely taken aback by the confrontation. His father says to him, tell me about the dream that you had. And he was very shaken aback. Take it. So his father tells him, Baruch, relax, don't get so excited. Tell me a dream. And he proceeded to tell him a dream, and the long version of it you can look up in the text. But the essence of the dream was he saw the Tzemach Tzedek and the Middle Rebbe and his uncles, the Baruch Shalom and the Maril and the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid and Talmidei, an incredible dream. And in his dream he actually is zoichet to hear a Torah from the Baal Shem Tov, from the Magid, from the Alt Rebbe, from the Middle Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek, which he was able to repeat. So on the surface of it, it's a great story. It's a story of a Rebbe at the age of, 15 or 16 or so, dreaming that he is seeing earlier Rabbeim. But in light of this Maimer, perhaps you can explain the reason that Rebbe Nishma Seiden sees it in a dream is because he can only see it in a dream. If he was awake, it would be overwhelming. On the other hand, when he wakes up, his father calls the dream out. His father makes the dream real. And he's overwhelmed, he's shaken by it, he cannot deal with taking what was in a dreamlike state and making it real, and his father calms him and says, don't lose it. Relax. It's a legitimate dream. Now let's make it not something that happened only while you're asleep. Let's make it something that's happening while you're awake. So in other words, when you have such a dream, there's two processes. The fact that it comes to you through a dream, and then the need to make it real when you're awake, so that you maximize what the dream gives you, which is the kind of substance, the kind of energy or inspiration that when you're awake you would not be able to receive. And the Maamar finishes. Line 48. When Mashiach comes, no more garments. No more need for dreams. No more need for distortions of reality so that we can survive, we can deal with it. There'll be no longer beknaf lavush v'chulu, no wings, no garments. V'lachein, and as a result, the Gemara says, "B'yemahu, at the time of Mashiach, yiyad Hashem echad u'shmei echad." Hashem will be one, and His name will be one. In other words, Shalai yehei melubash u'mechusa b'natik. The name of God will not have to be covered over with a concealment. V'yenikra k'meshanichta v'chuli. It will be read as it's written. That means, in other words, when Mashiach comes, we'll be able to handle godliness. We'll be able to relate to the idea that the presence of God is so pervasive in the world that essentially there's nothing but God. That now we can only handle that through a secondary garment, Adnai, which says, well, we exist, but God is the master. But there is also an advantage. Having gone through the Gullus-like state, certain levels of godliness which we would never be able to get are made available to us during the Gullus times, that emerge fully after Mashiach comes. Ki ayin ba'ayin yidu v'goymer, Mashiach comes, we'll have clarity. And once Mashiach comes, the pasuk says, B'shuv Hashem es Shivas Tzion, when God brings back the Shivas Tzion, hayinu kechom, and we look back at our earlier lives in hindsight and say, it was a dream. But now we have woken up. Woken up doesn't mean departed from the dream, but we can afford to dissect the dream, clarify the dream, remove the entanglement, remove the confusion, and have clarity about something that could only have been given to us before in the entangled state. Pirush, this means there will be a manifestation of the idea of a dream. In other words, what we were able to see in the dream. All of us will recognize, know, and reach Hachayas, the incredibly special life which we accessed during the Golus time from the dreamlike state. We will say in retrospect, we used to dream. And we used to dream means two things. A, we're not dreaming anymore. B, there was incredible benefit in our dreams. Our dreams gave us access to things we could never access otherwise. And as the Maamar concludes, it finally connects to the Parsha. In our Parsha, Yosef HaTzadik serves two roles. A, he's a dreamer, and B, he's an interpreter of dreams. Argues the Rebbe in the Maamar, the two are connected. Yosef is a dreamer because he's one of those special people that has access to incredibly lofty or deep communications, if you will, from God to man, that can only be communicated through a dream and need to be interpreted later so that we can process it properly. And for the same reason, he becomes the one who can interpret the dream when a communication is given to a person that can only be made available to that person through this entanglement. Yosef HaTzadik, when they're awake, has the clarity and the ability to disentangle it. It brings forth the special advantage of Yankiv and especially Yosef. And the Alter Rebbe says, "V'yesh bechina." There are certain aspects Yosef, that Yosef HaTzadik, who Yoser b'mayla b'madregas Moshe Rabbeinu Avashol, that not only is Yosef higher than his patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yankiv, he's higher even than Moshe Rabbeinu. And he gives us a little Kabbalah. He said, it says in Kabbalah that V'nadav v'avihu hem nefesh ruach shel Yosef. Nadav and Avihu were the two sons of Aaron HaKohen who died. And of course, their death is an indication of the fact that they were completely removed from this world. And they were the nefesh and ruach of Yosef. That means to say every soul has various levels. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. The nefesh of Yosef was in Avihu, the ruach of Yosef was in Nadav. And I suppose the argument is Nadav and Avihu couldn't exist. You know why? Because it was in Gullus. In Gullus, such a soul can find space, opportunity. In the clear world that existed in the time that the Mishkan was built and the Shekhinah rested, there's no space for Nadav and Avihu. And when the Pasuk says, "V'anachnu tmeim l'nefesh adam," that the Jewish people tell Moshe Rabbeinu we're spiritually unclean to the nefesh of a person, and we cannot bring the carbon Pesach. It says Kabbalah that nefesh means Avihu. Aval Nadav hayim bechinas ruach. Nadav is a higher level than Avihu. Ruach v'loy hayotzrichem azah b'shvila klal. There was no tumah whatsoever from Nadav, which is very controversial. You know, the Gemara says in Ksubis that there is, of course, a concept of Batla HaKahuna. There's a Taisves in Ksubis, I think that Gimel Amid Beis, that the day that Rabbeinu HaKadosh died, there was no Kahuna, there was no Tumah. But you wonder about the Nigle. How is it up in Nigle, especially in the Beis HaMikdash? But the Alter Rebbe argues here, when Nadav passed away, there was no need for Paraduma. And Nadav and Avihu represent levels of the Neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu. V'alav nemar v'ruach nediva. Sismacheni, Nediva, and Nadav, of course, are the same word. And Nadav, Nediva, has to do with the Madrega of Ruach. And again, I'm supposing that Nadav and Avihu's death are a reflection of the fact that such a neshama needs Golos in order to find a way of existing. V'zeu shekosav, as the pasuk goes on to say, Noihei katzein Yosef. Jewish people in the exile are like the sheep of Yosef. Kibezmana Golos, in the times of the Golos, Hanhogas Yisrael hu bebchinas Yosef, an incredibly high soul. The soul of Yosef HaTzadik leads the Jewish people. Shu bebchinas chaloim, it's the level of a dream that on the one hand means everything is entangled, on the other hand it means me'olam me'gulam v'chulu, we are somehow accessing incredibly highlights. V'lachei nikra ben Peiris, which is also why Yosef HaTzadik is called ben Peiris. Peiris means a favorite son, a special son, which is Oisius Poisid, which means to interpret, V'toifed, which means to tie, to bind, Shemachaber v'chulu. In other words, Yosef first resolves the entanglement of a dream and then puts things in their respective places so that everything has an order, which is what Geula ultimately means. That's why Yosef was the one who interpreted dreams.